the different ethnic communities. And on the other hand, the ethnic communities are also trying very hard to bridge out. Okay.
Well, I have Joe on the line, I think, who may have a different aspect to discuss. Joe?
Hello.
Go ahead.
I just have a real short story about the Chinese people, and that's that back in 1942, I attended a place called McKinley Grade School, which is up in North St. Louis. I was in the 5th grade then, probably 10 years old, and a young Chinese boy came into the class, and he was small. He was not very big, and the kids would pick on him. And for some reason, I turned out to be the kid that stood up for him. And so I kind of protected him for a while, and time went on. We got to know each other as friends. He would come over to the house. And then his mother and father lived here in St. Louis. The mother died. The father then went to China and brought over a Chinese wife. And in the process bringing the wife over, it really began to slowly disintegrate the family. Mm-hmm. And the family got progressively worse. There were 6 children. And that's Carl, the young boy, he kept coming over to the house more and more and more, and pretty soon he just came over and he stayed. That was in 1942, and he's still part of the family. His father had a restaurant down on, I forget now, 7th or 8th Street. The lady was right. It's up in North St. Louis, and we used to go down to his restaurant, and they tried to get me to eat these real old eggs. What are they called?
Oh, it's called a preserved egg. Some people call it the 1,000-year-old egg.
I don't know what they were, but they were just terrible, and they smelled terrible. And we wouldn't eat the eggs.
Yeah.
But eventually, Carl came to live with us. He went into the Army. He was part of the family, and he stayed. Well, he's still there. He's still part of the family. We just went to a funeral of one of the friends of ours from, 60 years ago. So we had a long-term relationship with the family. And it's been a really good relationship. It taught me an awful lot about look around and see what people are doing to other people, and don't let them do that. My profession, I wound up being a psychologist, the helper. So that was my short story about...
Well, thank you. Obviously, you were a psychologist even as a child.
Well, I think... absolutely. I think what happens there is you start the process off of helping, and then you wind up really being drawn into that area.
I want to remind people that they can call in at 382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Or the email is talk@kwmu-org. kwmu.org. I'm adding an extra dot. So try, folks. If you have trouble, try again. I like that story, particularly because it showed that the barriers can be broken and we're human beings. And what I'm wondering, you can see I'm struggling a little with myself, and I'm sure there are others who know that there's so much that's valuable in other cultures. Well, we have a lot of different cultures, and through the Chinese culture. How can are there places we can get together? Are there things we could learn about one another? Now, obviously, the book, which you have written, Chinese St. Louis, From Enclave to Cultural Community, Huping, Ling, read that and you'll know a lot more about it. But do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes. I think, as Harriet just mentioned, the book is a beginning. Yeah, but I think from both sides, from both ethnic community and the mainstream society, we all have to consciously, come together to be willing to learn each other's culture, to learn the difference in order to understand each other better. This is something general.
What do you think, Thomas?
Well, here, one of the things that I've noticed that in order for us to collaborate, it really is for people to understand. And then when you understand, equals I have to be accepting. In order to accept, really, is to be able to go out there and really have the great experience, being that I always tell everybody, why don't you just go over to China, look at the culture's a little bit different, it's going to be not the same, and accept it the way it is. That's how the Chinese cultures are.
Well, it's one of the great values, of course, of this country, that you do have the opportunity to come over and establish yourself. But at the same time, the question is, how can you make a contribution? And one of the things, you are a businessman. You're an investor, is that correct?
Investment banking.
Investment banking. I think it's interesting that I noticed in your book, Huping, and I would like to ask about it today, that there has been investment, particularly in the African American enterprises, because there's been sometimes some friction where there have been development to say, well, you don't hire us or we're excluded. And the Chinese community tends to be an investing community. And I think it's important that maybe you invest both in your own community and make cash available for others too. Have you been able to do that?
As far as collaborating with African American,
Yeah.
I think even back in 2000, I worked very well with a project that we're doing with Cecilia Nadell, with the Face of Love Towards the East, the China, I guess the National Orchestra, when they brought in the orchestra in from China and into the Palace Symphony Hall. And that collaboration itself was so great because we saw a lot of differences, but yet we were able to work together very well from different cultures.
Well, there is some, what I'm saying is there is some, you might say almost jealousy that exists, and I mentioned before about the success of the Asian students and the sense that other people are being excluded. Now you might say, well, it's good for the Asian and Asian American families that they encourage it. But at the same time, in this country, it's important that we learn how all of us to live together. And so I'm wondering in St. Louis, what the experience has been, and when you were writing your book, when you were interviewing people, what did you find in terms of acceptance back and forth?
I think the larger society's acceptance about the Chinese has gone a long way, and it has been evolving. Historically, from those old records I have encountered, in the very beginning, when the first Chinese by the name of Ali came here, seems he was pretty well accepted because he, according to the records, he was the only one recorded Chinese then. So he had someone else akin to associate with. So he mingled with the Irish community. He even married an Irish girl by the name of Sarah Graham. So apparently he was well accepted at least by the Irish immigrant community. And he swore oaths and he became a citizen and he voted for Democratic Party. And it was only later on when the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 was passed. So the nationwide there was anti-Chinese resentment. And the Chinese in St. Louis probably also suffered from this general discrimination.
I imagine the World War II made a huge difference because China became an ally and became part of our culture, you might say.
Right, great. Yeah, in 1940s, especially the World War II, was a great transition. And a lot of historians call World War II as a watershed, in the history, because China fought as part of a great alliance. So therefore, as a result, Chinese in general were more respected and better accepted. And that was the larger situation under which the anti-Chinese, this Chinese exclusion law was finally repealed in 1943.
So you don't feel any separation in that sense anymore. I mean, obviously you have your own identity, Thomas, but in terms of discrimination or laws against you, I guess even with this current kind of concern about mainland China being a big economic competitor. What about that?
Well, I'll tell you what, as the economy moves forward in the future, we have shifted our paradigm. And the paradigm is that I think, let me kind of go back into your question really, is that I think the Asian community have earned their badges in many ways, just because if Dr. Ling has talked about, how from restaurants to laundromats, and now the profession comes into play, IT engineers and investment bankers and so forth, down the line have earned the position within the community itself. So I see it as being a plus, and I think the acceptance is there because over the course of time, we had to work hard, and we knew that going into all this. But at the same time, I think that from the eyes of maybe the African American to the Caucasian and so forth, have seen that progress over the course of the timeline that we have built for the future of the Asian community.
Well, we have another call from Andy, but before we take that, why don't we take a break, and when we come back, we'll take another call, and we'll continue our conversation. I'm Harriet Woods, and St. Louis on the Air, and our subject is Chinese St. Louis. And our guests are Huping Ling, who is a professor at Truman State University, who's written a fascinating book, I think the first one, really, complete, about Chinese St. Louis, or the cultural community, which is as a Midwest community, not San Francisco, not New York. And Thomas Wong, who is managing director of St. Louis Capital, who represents